when a gaunt woman soaked through with rain stepped into the most secret nightclub of the most notorious Mafia empire in the southeastern United States. Clutching tightly a worn wooden box carved with the image of a sparrow, and asked to meet Rafael Varga himself, the entire bar that had been alive with noise suddenly froze as if the air had been drained away. The bartender, who had served in the underworld for 20 years, slowly set down a glass of whisky, his fingers trembling just slightly. 2 large bodyguards with Glock pistols hidden beneath their suits moved at once to stand behind her. No one laughed. No one questioned her. Only the sound of a saxophone continued its low, aching cry from the stage, as though it didn't know that the room had just changed forever. The woman didn't blink. She quietly placed the wooden box on the black marble counter, her fingers pale with cold as she opened the lid with the care of someone touching the remains of a soul. Inside the faded velvet lining lay a gold pocket watch, old, worn, yet still catching the yellow light like a lost star. Engraved on its case were 2 initials, A. V. When the old advisor of the Varga Empire, a man who had witnessed bloodshed across 4 decades in the underworld, was summoned and saw the object, he stood motionless. The hands that had once pulled a trigger without shaking now trembled like a leaf in the winter wind. It was the watch that had vanished 9 years earlier, on the fateful night when Don Aron Varga, Rafael's father, was shot dead on the steps of his own mansion. An item the entire empire had torn through every corner, every street, every corpse of their enemies to find. A symbol no one believed would ever be seen again. Until tonight, his voice rough, he asked her where she had gotten it, and the woman lifted her head, those gray-green eyes empty yet steady, in a way that was almost terrifying. My father kept it for 9 years. He told me that if a day ever came when I was so desperate I had nowhere left to go, I should bring it here. The entire club sank into a silence that only those who had stood before the barrel of a gun could understand. The old advisor drew in a long breath. "Who is your father?" She didn't hesitate. "Elijah Caldwell." The name fell into the room like a stone dropped onto a frozen lake. But what no one in that building, not even the most cold-blooded killers closing in around her, knew, what even she herself had never spoken aloud, was that this woman hadn't come only with a secret buried for 9 years. She was running from the man who had killed her father, and he was less than 48 hours behind her. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to press like to support the channel. Share it with the people you love because perhaps they too are waiting for a story that helps them believe in a second chance. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any emotional journeys that come next. I'll see you again in the next video. The old advisor, the man known as Silvano Bellini, did not take his eyes off the face of the woman standing before him. He had lived long enough in the shadows to understand that there are moments in a man's life in this line of work, no matter how many decades of experience he carries, when there is only one thing left to do. He slipped his hand quietly into the pocket of his vest and drew out a black phone. His finger pressed a number he knew so well he did not need to look, a number he had called only when something grave enough threatened to shake the entire Varga empire. Across the city, in a private meeting room in the center of Savannah, where the most powerful men of the southeastern United States were discussing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Rafael Varga stood at the table, one hand braced against a map of the port spread wide before him, the other holding a glass of wine he had not yet tasted. When the phone in his pocket vibrated, he did not need to check to know who it was. There was only one number in the world he would answer in the middle of such a meeting. He tilted his head, pressed the phone to his ear, and Silvano's voice came through, rough and brief in a way that chilled the air. "You need to come back now. It is about Elijah." Rafael froze for half a breath. The men around the table were still talking, still arguing about profit percentages and container schedules. But to him, it all became distant noise, as though echoing from another world. He set the glass down without taking a single sip. He did not apologize, did not explain, did not nod to anyone. He simply shrugged back into his black coat draped over the chair and walked out, leaving behind stunned looks and a silence no man in that room dared to question. His head of security, Tobias, was already waiting outside the door, and when he saw his employer's face, he did not need a single command. They moved down to the basement where a black Bentley was waiting, engine already running. The car door shut with a hard, hollow sound, and the vehicle shot out into the rainy night like a bullet fired into darkness. The streets of Savannah lay nearly empty beneath the December rain, the pale yellow streetlights reflecting off the soaked pavement, and the Bentley cut through rows of old Victorian houses like a black shark slicing through still water. Inside the car, Rafael sat upright, his back straight, his eyes turned toward the window but not truly seeing anything. The name Elijah had not been spoken for 9 years until that phone call. Not because it had been forgotten, but because no one in this empire dared speak it before the boss allowed it. And now Silvano, the most cautious and cold man he had ever known, was the one who had spoken it aloud. At the Obsidian Club, the woman was led to a VIP room on the 2nd floor, 4 walls upholstered in black leather, a large sofa at the center, and a frosted glass window overlooking the dance floor below. A young waitress, her hands trembling slightly, set down a warm towel and a glass of hot lemon water in front of her. She did not touch either. She simply sat there, her back straight, both hands resting on a wooden box carved with sparrows, as though it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground. Drops of water from her hair continued to fall onto her shoulders, soaking through the thin fabric, but she did not shiver. She had learned long ago how not to. The door opened without a sound. A woman stepped inside, tall, her red hair pulled into a neat knot at the back of her neck, wearing a perfectly tailored dark gray suit. It was Cordelia Marsh, the boss's housekeeper and private secretary, a woman about whom people in the Savannah underworld often said that if she ever smiled at you, you should begin to worry. Cordelia stood there, 3 steps away from the stranger, and said nothing. She only looked. She looked into those gray-blue eyes, at the thin shoulders trembling not from cold but from something far deeper, at the fingers gripping the wooden box so tightly that the knuckles had turned white, and in the red-haired woman's gaze, there was something Wren had not seen directed at her in many years. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. They said nothing to each other. Only the ticking of the wall clock filled the silent room, counting down to something both women knew was drawing very near. Then suddenly, from the hallway outside, footsteps sounded. Not hurried heels of someone running, not the soft steps of a server. It was the sound of Italian leather shoes striking the oak floor, slow, steady, each step like the beat of something unstoppable. Each step closer, each step clearer. Cordelia lifted her head slightly, but did not turn. The woman on the sofa did not move either, but her hands tightened around the wooden box just a little more. And for the first time in that long, endless night, a drop of water from her hair fell onto the back of her hand, quiet and soft, as though even the storm outside was holding its breath, waiting for the moment that door would open. The door to the VIP room opened without a single creak, as though even it understood that the man stepping through did not need to be announced. Rafael Varga stood at the threshold for half a second, and that half second was enough to alter the air in the room forever. He was taller than any man in his empire, broad-shouldered, wearing a 3-piece black suit tailored in Milan, with a silk tie of the same dark shade drawn close against a flawless white shirt. His hair was thick and black, swept back to reveal a sharply cut face, a jawline honed like a blade, and a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw. But what made people fall silent when they looked at him was not his height, not the suit, not the gold raven ring on the little finger of his left hand. It was his eyes, black as coal, cold, unreadable, looking at other people as though they were entries in a ledger waiting to be calculated. Cordelia stepped back slightly, yielding the space. Rafael entered the room, and at that exact moment, the woman seated on the sofa lifted her head. Their eyes met for the first time in their lives, and in that instant the entire room seemed to narrow into a single taut line stretched between them, like the string of an instrument pulled to breaking. On one side were the black eyes of a man who had ruled an underground kingdom for 9 years, who had seen too much blood, given too many orders, and no longer remembered what it meant to tremble. On the other were the gray-blue eyes of a woman who had lost everything, who had fled across 4 states, who no longer had tears left for anyone, not even herself. They did not nod to one another. They did not need to. Rafael did not sit at once. He offered no greeting. He crossed the room in measured steps, stopped before the low table where the wooden box lay open, and looked down. The gold pocket watch rested there on the faded velvet, still gleaming like a star that had wandered for years before finding its way home. He bent down, his long fingers lifting the watch, glancing at the 2 letters A and V engraved on the gold case, then placing it back onto the velvet, with a care so strange it almost hurt to witness. Not a muscle in his face moved, not a breath in him faltered, but Silvano, standing in silence at the corner of the room, had seen enough. He had served this family for 4 decades. He knew when a Varga was calm, and when a Varga was only pretending to be calm. Rafael turned, sat in the armchair across from the woman, rested his elbows on his knees, laced his fingers together, and looked directly at her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask how many roads she had crossed to reach this room. The first question he gave her was low and short, like a blade passing through silk. How old were you when your father died? She did not blink. 18. Her voice was soft but steady, as though she had prepared that answer for 9 years. Through sleepless nights, through meals eaten alone, through every time she had looked into a mirror and failed to recognize the woman staring back at her, Rafael gave the smallest nod. What did he tell you about me? This time she was silent longer, not because she did not know the answer, but because that answer was the only thing she had carried for 9 years. The final instruction of her father before that fateful night, the one thing she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even to the man who had tricked her into an engagement. He said that if I ever became desperate, you might be the last person in the world who would understand. Rafael looked at her for a few seconds more, and in those black eyes no one could have read what was happening inside him. Then he stood, neither too fast nor too slow. He turned to Cordelia and said only one sentence. Take her to Ravenhurst. Cordelia did not ask for clarification. She only inclined her head, stepped toward the woman, and signaled for her to rise. The woman gathered the wooden box into her arms, stood, and followed Cordelia out of the room. Silvano looked once more at Rafael before leaving, but Rafael did not look back at him. He stood in silence beside the low table, his gaze fixed on the pocket watch resting on the faded velvet, and it seemed as though the room around him had vanished. The black Bentley raced away from Obsidian again, this time in a convoy of 3 cars. The rain had softened, but the night sky over Savannah remained black and starless. The woman sat in the back seat beside Cordelia, her eyes turned toward the window, her hands still wrapped tightly around the wooden box as if holding a child. The convoy left the center of the city, passed through the old streets, crossed beyond the harbor district, and turned onto a narrow road running beside the Savannah River. And at the end of that road, in the blurred rain of a southern winter night, it appeared. A black stone mansion beside the river, its long windows like eyes gazing out into the dark, warm yellow light, glowing faintly behind heavy curtains. Ravenhurst, the place where, for 9 years, not a single strange woman had been permitted to set foot. Until tonight, Cordelia walked ahead, her steps soft upon the Persian carpet that stretched along the long corridor of the west wing of the estate, leading Wren past closed oak doors and ancestral portraits of the Varga family gazing down from the walls. Not a single word passed between the 2 women along that entire walk. At last, Cordelia stopped before a door at the end of the corridor, opened it, and gestured for Wren to step inside. The room beyond was spacious, but not excessive in its luxury. A 4-poster bed dressed in white linens, a stone fireplace burning low, and a walnut dressing table set near the window. On the bed lay a set of dry clothes already arranged with care, a cream-colored sweater and soft flannel trousers. On the low table beside the fireplace, a silver tray held a bowl of chicken soup, still releasing a thin curl of steam, a round loaf of bread, and a cup of chamomile tea. Cordelia spoke softly, her voice low and clear. The bathroom is at the back. If you need anything, there is a bell beside the bed. Wren gave the smallest nod, but did not move. She remained standing in the middle of the room, holding the wooden box carved with sparrows against her chest, as though it were the only thing left in the world that still belonged to her. Cordelia watched her for another second, then quietly moved toward the door, intending to give the stranger her first moment of privacy after many long days. But when Wren finally moved, when she set the box down on the bed and began to remove the damp wool scarf wrapped around her neck, Cordelia had not yet stepped outside. The scarf fell to the floor, and in the warm light of the lamp, Cordelia saw, across the pale skin of the young woman's neck, stretched dark bruises running from one side to the other, some already fading into yellow and green, others newer, darker, and beneath those layers, faint shadows of even older wounds that had nearly disappeared but still lingered on the skin. These were not the marks of an accident. They were the long record of something that had been repeated too many times over too many months. Cordelia stood still for a single breath. Once a family lawyer, before entering this world, she had seen marks like these in forensic files, in photographs of victims, in courtrooms that were never truly just. She had learned long ago that in moments like this, asking questions was the worst thing one could do. She did not ask. She only inclined her head slightly, murmured a quiet good night, and closed the door behind her. the corridor fell silent. Cordelia walked straight through the west wing, down the main staircase, across the great hall, and stopped before the black wooden door of the master's study. She knocked twice, short and even, then pushed the door open without waiting for a reply. Rafael stood by the window, a glass of whisky in his hand, his gaze fixed on the dark river beyond. He did not turn, but Cordelia knew he had heard her. She did not waste words. She spoke only once, her voice low and clear, meant for one man alone in that room, on her neck, many layers, for a long time. Rafael said nothing. He set the whiskey glass down. The faint sound of glass touching oak echoed through the silence like a distant crack of thunder. He turned, walked past Cordelia, and left the study. Cordelia did not follow. She knew she did not need to. Rafael climbed the main staircase with measured steps, neither fast nor slow, crossed the west wing corridor, and stopped before the door at its end. He knocked twice, far softer than one might expect from a man like him, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. Wren had removed her damp coat, and now wore the cream sweater Cordelia had left for her. Sitting on the edge of the bed with the wooden box still resting in her lap, she lifted her head as he entered, and in the moment their eyes met for the second time that night. Neither of them moved. Rafael stood in the middle of the room, about 4 steps away, not coming closer, not sitting down. His voice was low and flat when he spoke. "Who did this to you?" Wren did not answer. She looked at him for a second, then turned her face away, her eyes settling on the low burning fire in the hearth. Rafael did not repeat the question. He waited. The space between them thickened until one could almost hear the soft crackle of wood in the flames. At last he spoke again, his voice still low, still even, but this time something else moved beneath it, something even Cordelia rarely heard after so many years. "You do not need to be afraid here, but I need to know what I am facing." Wren still did not look back at him, but she answered, her voice so soft it was almost not there at all. "Someone is looking for me. That is all. No name, no face, no explanation." Rafael stood for a few seconds more, waiting to see if she would say anything else. She did not. He gave a nod so slight it could almost not be seen, then turned, stepped out of the room, and closed the wooden door behind him with a quietness that felt almost unnatural. The west wing corridor sank back into silence, but the moment the door shut behind him, Rafael Varga stopped. He stood there in the long, dim corridor beneath the faint yellow glow of the hanging lights, and his right hand, the hand that had once given orders no one dared speak aloud, slowly curled into a fist so tight that the knuckles blanched white, his nails pressing deep into his palm until he could feel the pain. He stood like that for a long time. And in Ravenhurst, on that rainy night in December, no one saw the moment when the most powerful man in the southeastern United States felt, for the first time in 9 years, an emotion he had sworn he would never allow himself to feel again. After Rafael had gone, and the sound of his footsteps had faded at the far end of the corridor, Wren remained seated on the edge of the bed for a long while, without moving, without breathing any deeper, simply listening. She had learned long ago that silence inside an unfamiliar house is never true silence. There is always something breathing beneath it, the faint whisper of a hinge, the creak of floorboards in the next room, a heartbeat that does not belong to you. Only when she was certain no one would return did she slowly rise. She walked to the door, turned the lock as gently as possible so that it made almost no sound, then lifted the small armchair beside the fireplace, dragged it across the carpet, and wedged the back of it beneath the doorknob. It was a habit she had taught herself in the final months before she ran, when she began to understand that the house she had been living in was no longer her home, but a cage held shut by someone else's hand. From the pocket of the coat that Cordelia had hung on the stand near the door, she took out a small knife with a wooden handle, the one she had carried through 4 days of flight. She slid it beneath the pillow on the right side of the bed, where her right hand could reach it in the dark without needing to think. Then she climbed onto the bed, leaned back against the walnut headboard, pulled the blanket over her knees, and placed the wooden box carved with sparrows in her lap. Rain still struck the window, no longer violent as it had been earlier in the night, but steady, each drop trailing down the glass like a silver thread beneath the light of the lamp. Outside, the Black River savannah moved through the darkness, and now and then, the low horn of a tugboat sounded from very far away. She had not intended to open the box. She had opened it only twice that night, once at Obsidian, and once in front of Rafael Varga. and each time she had felt as if she were lifting the lid of a coffin for a spirit that had never fully rested. But still, her hand moved. Her fingers unfastened the small brass clasp dulled by time, and the lid lifted with a soft click. The gold pocket watch lay there on the faded velvet, the letters A and V engraved on its case, still catching the weak light. She had looked at that watch hundreds of times over the past 9 years, had lifted it, set it down, and asked herself why her father had guarded it so carefully. But that night, for the first time, she noticed something else. Beneath the velvet lining, at the bottom of the box, there was a small fold she had never seen before. She slipped her finger beneath it and tugged lightly. It was a photograph. The black and white paper had yellowed at the edges, the image square in the way old cameras once captured the world. She raised it closer to the lamp and drew in the faintest breath. In the photograph stood her father, Elijah Caldwell, younger than she had ever remembered him, perhaps only in his early 30s, his hair still dark, standing on a dock with one hand in his pocket and the other resting on the shoulder of another man. That man was about the same age, a little taller, with black hair combed back and a sharply cut face that Wren recognized at once, even though she had never met him in her life. It was Aron Varga, Rafael's father. Both men were smiling, not the smile of courtesy, not the smile of businessmen, but the kind of smile only men who had once drunk themselves senseless together, once slept on the same boat, once trusted each other enough to turn their backs could ever share. Wren ran her fingertip lightly across her father's face in the photograph. In all her 27 years, her father had never once spoken the name Aron Varga. He had been a quiet clockmaker in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town, repairing watches brought to him by whatever customers came, eating dinner with his wife and daughter in the evening, reading books by the fire in winter. She had always believed she knew everything about him. That night she realized she had never truly known him at all. She laid the photograph across her knees, her left hand still holding the wooden box, her right still resting over the gold pocket watch. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. The bedside lamp cast a small circle of warmth across the white bedspread, and beyond that circle the room sank into a kind of gentle darkness that did not feel frightening. Minute by minute, time moved on. The wall clock ticked steadily, and Wren did not know how many times it had ticked before she looked toward the window and saw that the sky beyond had begun to change from black into a thin gray blue. Her first dawn at Ravenhurst was coming. She still sat there, leaning against the headboard, the wooden box in her lap, the black and white photograph resting on her knees, her gray-blue eyes wide open as they looked toward the light slowly slipping through the gap in the curtains. She did not cry. She did not sleep. She only waited for the new day to arrive, like someone who had waited so long that she no longer even knew what it was she had been waiting for. When the first light of morning had fully slipped through the narrow gap in the curtains and turned the gray-blue of early dawn into the pale gold of a dry December day, Wren was still sitting on the bed, the blanket still drawn across her knees, the wooden box still resting in her lap. She had not realized what she had been waiting for until the knock came, 3 steady taps, neither hurried nor demanding. She hesitated for a second, then lifted the chair that had been braced against the door, turned the lock, and opened it slightly. The man standing in the hallway did not resemble anyone she had seen in this house until that moment. He was large, broad-shouldered, wearing a clean white apron over a dark blue shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing sun-browned forearms marked with old scars, the kind a man earns after living a different life before arriving somewhere like this. In his hands was a wooden tray, and on that tray was a bowl of oatmeal still giving off steam, a glass of warm milk, 2 slices of toasted bread spread with butter, and a small plate of soft scrambled eggs. He did not smile, but there was no threat in his brown eyes. He gave her a small nod, his voice low and rough like gravel beneath water. "I am Garrett, the head cook. Would you mind stepping aside?" Wren nodded faintly, stepped back, and the large man moved into the room with a gentleness that did not match his size. He set the tray down on the table beside the fireplace, adjusted the dishes so that they sat in neat alignment, then straightened, wiping his hands on his apron in a quiet, habitual motion. He looked at her once, not long, not searching, only the glance of a man who had raised children and knew what exhaustion looked like when it settled into young shoulders. He spoke again, still low, still rough, but with something warm beneath it. "My daughters are about your age. If you need anything, knock on the kitchen door, ground floor, east wing, just past the hall. Anytime. He did not wait for her reply. He only gave one more nod and turned to leave. Ren stood still, her hand still resting on the door latch, watching the breadth of his back until it disappeared around the bend of the corridor. And in that moment, when no one was watching her, something she had buried deep within herself over the past 4 months rose suddenly in her chest, tightening around her throat, burning at the corners of her eyes. She stood there, hands gripping the doorframe, jaw clenched. She did not let a single tear fall. She had promised herself from the first night she fled that house that she would not cry again. Not for fear, not for hunger, not for exhaustion. But this morning, standing in a room inside the estate of a stranger who ruled an empire she did not understand, she nearly wept because a large kitchen man had told her he had 2 daughters her age. She drew in a long breath, closed her eyes, and waited for the heat behind them to fade. Then she turned, walked to the table, and finished the bowl of warm oatmeal. It was the first full meal she had eaten in more than a week. After breakfast, Ren could not remain inside the room any longer. She opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and began to walk. Without purpose, without direction. Simply walking. She passed portraits of the Varga ancestors, tall ceramic vases placed at turning corners, thick Persian carpets that swallowed the sound of her footsteps entirely. She turned right, then left, climbed a short set of stairs, descended another corridor, until she realized she had wandered into a part of the estate where the air felt different. In the north wing, the light was dimmer, the dust heavier in the air, the hanging lamps unlit, leaving only natural light spilling in from tall windows. And at the end of that corridor, there was a door. Dark oak, taller than the others in the house, carved with intricate patterns of clockwork gears, fitted with a brass lock dulled by time. Ren stopped before it. She did not know why. She heard nothing from within, but there was something about that door that would not let her move past it. She placed her palm against the wood, felt the cold surface beneath her skin, and stood like that for a long while. A voice came from behind her. She did not start, only turned her head slightly. Cordelia stood at the far end of the corridor, her red hair tied neatly back, dressed in a gray gown, her hands folded before her. She did not look like someone who had followed Ren silently through the estate, but Ren knew she had. Cordelia stepped closer, stopped a few paces away, and looked at the door with her. That is Aaron's watchroom. After he passed, no one in the family could repair them. Rafael ordered it sealed forever. Ren did not remove her hand from the door. She only asked, her voice soft, almost distant. How many? Cordelia was silent for a second, as though weighing whether to answer. Then she said evenly, 143. All of them have stopped. Ren let the number settle into the quiet. She thought of her father, of his hands, of the afternoons she had spent as a child sitting beside his workbench, watching him take apart the gears of a watch that had stopped beating. She thought of the number 143, a number too precise to be chance. Then she spoke again, still soft, but clear enough that Cordelia could not mistake it. My father used to repair them. Cordelia did not respond. She only looked at Ren, her green eyes sharpening in a way that had not been there before, reassessing the woman standing before her entirely. Then she inclined her head slightly, a faint, almost incomplete smile touching her lips, and said one final sentence before turning away. Stay if you want. I have somewhere to be. And she walked off, a little faster than when she had come. Down the corridor, down the staircase, straight toward the study of her employer, where light was still burning through the narrow line beneath the dark wooden door. Cordelia did not need to knock on the study door more than once. When she stepped inside and spoke the words she had just heard in the north wing corridor, Rafael was sitting behind the large oak desk, both hands resting on its surface, his black eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He did not ask her to repeat it. He did not question it. He simply rose, straightened the collar of his suit, and walked out of the room. Ren was still standing at the end of the north wing corridor, her hand still resting against the wooden surface of the door, when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She did not turn. She knew who it was. Rafael stopped beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then he drew a small brass key from the inner pocket of his jacket, its surface dulled by time, inserted it into the lock, and turned it. The click of the mechanism releasing after 9 years of silence sounded dry and final, like a confession. He pushed the door open, and the room revealed itself before them. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, tarnished brass, dried oil, and the dust of years untouched. Sunlight streamed through a tall window at the far end, forming a long pillar of light, and within that column, particles of dust drifted slowly as though they were small stars suspended in a universe that had stopped moving. And then Wren saw them. The clocks. They stood everywhere in the room, lining tall oak shelves that reached the ceiling along both walls, hanging from brass hooks, resting inside glass cases dimmed by dust, lying still upon work tables covered in white cloth. Grandfather clocks as tall as a man. Ornate glass cabinet clocks. Gilded brass table clocks. Pocket watches arranged in small display boxes. French wall clocks. Antique wristwatches aligned neatly upon velvet trays. 143 of them, all silent. Not a single hand moved. Not a single ticking sound existed. The room felt like a graveyard of time. Rafael remained at the threshold. He did not step inside. His voice came low and slow, without looking at her. I am not asking you to do anything. If you wish to leave this place after we resolve your situation, I will not keep you. He paused. But if you want to try? His gaze shifted toward the largest grandfather clock standing in the far right corner, taller than Wren herself, crafted from dark walnut, its brass face engraved with intricate patterns, its glass doors dulled by years of dust. This was my father's favorite. Wren did not respond. She looked at the clock for a long breath. Then she stepped into the room. She placed the wooden box carved with sparrows on the nearest table, opened the cloth bag she had carried through 4 days of escape, and took out the one thing inside it, a smaller black wooden case with a worn leather handle. Her tools, the only thing from her father she had never abandoned, even when she had been forced to leave everything else behind. She opened it on the white-covered work table, revealing rows of small stainless steel instruments arranged in careful order. Screwdrivers in 8 sizes, fine tweezers for gears, a precision lamp, a magnifying lens for her eye, a vial of specialized oil, a strip of soft leather for polishing glass, a delicate brush for dust. She fitted the magnifier over her right eye, tied her hair back, and began to work. She said nothing. Rafael did not enter. He remained leaning against the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, watching. Behind him, in the corridor, Silvano and Cordelia had arrived, standing in silence, neither speaking. 3 adults watched a young woman work as though it were a ritual they had been waiting 9 years to witness. Wren opened the glass panel of the grandfather clock and began to dismantle it piece by piece. She removed the heavy brass pendulum from its hook and placed it carefully upon velvet cloth. She took off the dial, revealing the mechanism inside, where dozens of small brass gears had not turned since 9 winters ago. Her fingers moved with such precision that there was not a single wasted motion. She removed each gear, laying them in order upon a green felt cloth, then cleaned each one carefully with the brush, the tweezers, and tiny drops of oil placed with the tip of a needle. She did not rush. She did not pause. She did not drink a single sip of water for 3 hours. The sun outside rose higher. The column of light shifted slowly across the wooden floor, and the dust in the air gradually settled as she worked. Silvano had lowered himself into a chair in the hallway at some point. Cordelia leaned against the wall, her arms folded, her eyes never leaving the scene. Rafael remained at the doorway, unmoving as stone. At last, when the beam of sunlight nearly touched the opposite wall, Wren placed the final gear back into position. She removed the magnifier, set it down, and gently pushed the pendulum to one side. Just a light push. Then she stepped back. The pendulum swung left, then right, and the first ticking sound emerged. The entire room fell silent. It was not loud. It was only the soft contact of metal against metal, steady, patient, just as it had once been for decades before it stopped. But in that room, in that moment, it sounded like the first heartbeat of someone waking after 9 years of sleep. Silvano rose abruptly from his chair. Cordelia lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Rafael did not move for a full breath. Then he took one step into the room, then another. He walked past the silent clocks, through the column of drifting light, until he stood directly behind Wren. He said nothing. She did not turn. The ticking continued, steady and alive in the air, like the pulse of something that had just been brought back to life. Then he lifted his right hand and placed it gently upon her left shoulder. Just a touch, no pressure, no lingering movement, only resting there for the span of 2 ticks. Then he withdrew his hand, turned, and walked out of the room. past Silvano, past Cordelia, down the corridor without speaking a single word. Wren remained standing before the clock that had begun to beat again, her hand still resting on the edge of the work table, and on the place where his hand had touched her shoulder. The warmth remained long after he had gone. After Rafael had left, and Silvano had been gently guided by Cordelia to a chair near the small window at the end of the corridor to rest, Wren remained alone in the clockroom. She worked until the sun had drifted toward the west, and the light inside shifted from pale gold into the deep orange-red of late afternoon. She managed to repair 2 more clocks, a gilded brass table clock and a small pocket watch with a blue enamel face, and now both had joined the steady ticking of the large grandfather clock in the corner. 3 separate rhythms, 3 distinct pulses, weaving together into a quiet music that filled a room that had been silent for 9 years. She returned to her room at dusk, bathed, changed into the second set of dry clothes Cordelia had left for her, and sat beside the fireplace with the wooden box carved with sparrows resting on her knees. She did nothing. She only watched the flames. A knock came at the door, 3 even taps. She had already grown familiar with that rhythm. She answered softly, and Cordelia stepped inside, carrying a silver tray with a white porcelain teapot, 2 small cups, and a plate of butter cookies. She did not ask for permission to enter, and she did not explain why she had come. She simply set the tray on the low table between the 2 armchairs facing the fire, poured 1 cup and slid it toward Wren, then poured another for herself and sat down opposite her. She did not speak. She only drank her tea. Steam rose from the cups, mingling with the warm glow of the fire, and the room was so quiet that the faint crackle of wood in the hearth could be heard clearly. Wren held the teacup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep through the thin porcelain into her palms. She looked at Cordelia, and Cordelia did not look back. She sat there with her legs gently together, her back straight, her green eyes resting lightly on the flames. It was a kind of silence Wren had not known for a very long time, a silence that did not demand, did not press, only waited. In the end, it was Wren who spoke first, her voice as soft as the steam rising from the cup. "What do you want to know?" Cordelia set her cup down on its saucer, the faint sound of porcelain touching, porcelain echoing softly. She lifted her gaze, and for the first time that afternoon, her eyes were direct and gentle. "Only what you are willing to tell." Wren was silent for a moment. She looked down into her tea, into the brown surface faintly reflecting the fire beside her. Then she began to speak, not in order, not in structure, but in fragments of memory falling loose after too many months locked away. She spoke of the man who had entered her life 6 months after the night her father died, a young detective from the police department, assigned to her father's case, who came to see her again and again, with careful questions and a concern she had once mistaken for compassion. He brought small bouquets each time he visited, remembered her mother's name, asked whether she had eaten. She spoke of his smile, of the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman left in the world. She spoke of the proposal by the river, of the small ring he had given her, of the wedding plans they had sketched together on paper napkins in a cafe. Then she spoke of when everything began to change. At first it was small questions about where she went, whom she met. Then the quiet appearances in places she had never said she would be. Then her old friends disappearing one by one, without explanation. No calls, no messages. Then the nights she found herself in emergency rooms at 3 different hospitals, each time with a reason the nurses wrote down without asking. Each time with him beside her, holding her hand, answering for her. Cordelia did not interrupt. She only sat there, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze still gentle, and listened. Wren continued, speaking of her mother. Her mother had struggled with mental illness for years, had taken medication regularly since Wren was a child, had endured long periods of collapse after losing loved ones. When Wren's father died, she could not hold on any longer. She passed away from her condition worsening 6 months after his funeral. On a spring night, Wren would never forget, when the scent of magnolia blossoms drifted through the hospital window. From that moment on, Wren had been alone, and that man had been there, always there, ready to hold her, ready to arrange the funeral, ready to move her into his house so she would not have to be alone. Wren took a sip of tea. Her hands did not tremble, but her voice had dropped lower. Then she spoke of the night 4 days ago. She had been in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner, the window open to let in the night air, when she heard his voice drifting in from the backyard. He was on the phone with someone she did not know, his voice low, but clear enough for her to hear every word. The girl is starting to suspect. Elijah hid something we need. If we cannot get it, she has to disappear." Wren said she had stood frozen at the sink, a plate still in her hand, the water still running. For a stretch of time she could not measure. When she finally turned, he was standing in the doorway behind her, and she knew at once from his eyes that he knew she had heard. That night, he locked her in the bedroom upstairs. But he forgot one thing. She was the daughter of a clockmaker, and her hands were more skilled than he had ever imagined. She used a small steel hairpin, the only thing left in her coat pocket, to release the window latch from the inside. She climbed out onto the ledge, lowered herself down along the balcony vines, and ran out of the property in her nightclothes, carrying only a canvas bag with the wooden box, her small knife, her father's tools, and a small amount of cash. From that moment until she stepped into Savannah the night before, had been 4 days. Wren stopped. She did not continue. She only looked down at the tea that had gone cold in her hands. Cordelia said nothing. She set her cup down, then very slowly reached across the space between them and placed her right hand over the back of Wren's left hand for a few seconds. A brief, steady touch, without softness. Then she withdrew her hand, stood, gave Wren a small nod, and left the room. The West Wing corridor fell silent again, but Cordelia did not return to her office. She crossed the great hall, descended the main staircase, then continued down a narrower set of stairs, leading to a basement level that only a few people in Ravenhurst knew existed. At the end of that stairway, she entered a code into a steel door and stepped into the hidden server room of the Varga family. The server room lay deep beneath the ground, protected by 3 layers of steel doors and a coded system that only 4 people in the entire Varga Empire were permitted to access. Inside, there were no windows, no wall clocks, nothing except rows of servers running quietly behind thick glass panels and 3 large monitors set upon a black metal desk. Cordelia stepped to the desk, pulled out the swivel chair, and sat down. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, and the screens came alive at once. A few minutes later, Silvano descended the final steps, clearing his throat softly into his hand. His walk was slower than usual, and when he lowered himself into the chair beside Cordelia, he set his cane carefully against the desk. He did not ask what Cordelia had heard from Wren. Cordelia did not explain. They had worked together long enough to understand that in situations like this, a single name was enough. Cordelia typed 6 words, then pressed enter. Detective Wyatt Crane, Savannah Police Department. The result appeared almost instantly. A police profile opened on the left screen, with a portrait photograph in the upper corner. The man in the image was in his mid-30s. Sandy, blonde hair cut short in a military style, bright blue eyes, a sharp face carrying a half smile as though he knew someone would be looking at this photograph one day. Silvano narrowed his eyes, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses higher on the bridge of his nose, and began to read. The file showed that Wyatt Crane had received 3 commendations within the past 5 years, had been promoted to detective at the age of 29, and maintained strong relationships with his superiors and several senior colleagues. On the surface, it was the record of a model officer. Cordelia scrolled further down to the section that most people ignored, the list of cases assigned to him, arranged by year. She scrolled back to the year Elijah Caldwell died, and she froze. Silvano leaned closer to the screen. His eyes stopped at a single line, a line that no one in the Varga family had thought to revisit in 9 years, because that case had never belonged to them, had never touched their empire, had never fallen within their concern. Until tonight. The first officer on the scene of the homicide of Elijah Caldwell, the night of November 7th, 9 years earlier. Officer Wyatt Crane, badge number 7307, South Savannah Precinct. At the time, he had been 26 years old, newly sworn in as a full officer for less than a year. Cordelia opened the detailed reports. The crime scene analysis written by Crane himself, the initial witness statements taken by him, the report on pursuing and neutralizing the suspect, also carried out by him. The suspect was described as a homeless man of unknown identity, believed to have broken into Elijah's home with intent to rob. According to Crane's report, the suspect fled when discovered, fired in resistance during pursuit, and died from return fire by Officer Crane in an alley 3 blocks north of the scene. There were no other witnesses, no surveillance cameras in that area. No family ever came forward to claim the body. The case had been closed within 48 hours. Silvano remained still for a long time. Cordelia did not dare turn to look at him. He had lived long enough to recognize when a story carried the wrong scent, and this one smelled like a performance constructed too tightly, without a single visible crack. A young officer, newly assigned, who just happened to be first at the scene, just happened to pursue the suspect alone, just happened to be the one who fired the fatal shot, just happened to close the case in 2 days, and just happened, 6 months later, to appear in the life of the victim's daughter with flowers in his hand and a careful smile. Silvano gave the faintest shake of his head. Cordelia printed the entire file from the machine in the corner, gathered the pages into a black leather folder, and handed it to him. He took it, pushed himself up with his cane, and walked toward the stairs. He did not speak. When Silvano reached Rafael's study, he did not knock. He simply opened the door and placed the folder upon the large oak desk. Rafael sat behind it, an unlit cigar resting between his fingers, his dark gaze fixed on empty space. He glanced down at the folder for a single second, then drew it closer and opened it. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 7. The young head of the Varga Empire read every line, every word, without skipping anything. His face did not change, but Silvano had stood in this very place 9 years earlier, on another night, when another file had been laid upon the same desk, and he had learned then to read Rafael Varga not through his expression, but through his silence. When Rafael finally closed the file, he did not rise immediately. He looked down at the desk, and his right hand moved to the left, where a small crystal object shaped like a raven with its wings spread rested upon a brass base. It was the last gift his father had given him on his 23rd birthday, only months before that fateful night. For 9 years, he had kept it beside him in every office he had ever occupied, a silent reminder that never left him. He tightened his grip around the crystal paperweight. Then he raised his hand and slammed it down onto the oak desk. The sound that followed was not shattering, for crystal crafted for a man like him does not break easily, but a dull, thunderous impact that shook the entire room, rattling the glasses on the cabinet in the corner. Silvano did not flinch. He simply stood with his hands folded before him. He had been waiting for that sound. He knew it would come. Rafael held the paperweight pressed against the desk for a few breaths, his knuckles white. Then he released it and leaned back in his chair. He did not look at Silvano. He looked toward the far wall where a large portrait of his father hung in a gilded frame, and he spoke, his voice so low it nearly vanished into the fire in the hearth, yet clear enough that every word seemed carved into the air. He caused her father's death, and then he used that very pain to claim her. The days that followed passed in the sound of ticking. Each morning Wren woke when the first strands of sunlight slipped through the narrow gap in her curtains, pulled on the sweater Cordelia had left folded in the wardrobe, ate the breakfast Garrett brought up without fail, and walked straight to the room in the north wing. She carried her father's black leather tool case over her shoulder, and her steps were no longer hesitant like they had been on the first day, but had begun to find a rhythm, the rhythm of someone returning home. The clock room slowly came back to life. After the first great pendulum came a gilded brass table clock, then a pocket watch with a blue enamel face, then a French wall clock, with 2 small cast bronze lions flanking the dial, then a glass cabinet clock with a cuckoo bird inside, then smaller ones, simpler ons, that did not need to be dismantled completely, but only cleaned and oiled. Each time a new set of hands began to move, another layer of sound filled the room, and by the end of the week, the entire space had become a choir of uneven ticking that wove together like a symphony of time being brought back to life. Rafael appeared more often. In the beginning, he never stepped fully into the room. He stood in the doorway, a glass of whisky in his hand, his dark eyes quietly observing her fingers at work. Sometimes he stayed only a few minutes before leaving. Sometimes he remained longer, even half an hour, without saying a word, without asking her to stop. Wren grew used to his presence to the point that she no longer needed to turn her head to know whether he was there. The air would grow slightly heavier, the light at the doorway dimmed just enough, and she would know. She continued working. He continued watching. It was a silent agreement neither of them needed to sign. On the 3rd night since she first entered that room, something changed. She was bent over the glass cabinet clock with the cuckoo bird, trying to adjust a hair-thin spring warped by time, when she heard the familiar footsteps. But this time they did not stop at the doorway. They came all the way in. Wren lifted her head. Rafael was walking toward her work table, holding a glass of red wine in each hand. He set one down beside her tool case, kept the other, then pulled the leather armchair across from her and sat. She looked at the wine, then at him. "I do not drink while I work." Her voice was soft, but clear. Rafael looked at her over the rim of his glass, his eyes no longer cold as they had been in the beginning, but carrying something deeper, something more tired, more grounded. "Tonight you do." 3 words, nothing more. Not a command, not a demand, only a suggestion laid between them like a thin thread. Ren studied him for another second. Then she placed the tweezers onto the tray, removed the magnifying lens from her eye, and reached for the glass. It was the first time in 3 days she had stopped working mid-task. She did not drink right away. She held the glass in her hand, felt its weight, watched the dark red liquid swirl gently within the thin crystal. Rafael remained silent for a while. He looked down at his glass, then toward the window, where the savannah night had turned completely black and rain had begun to fall again in light taps against the stone planters outside. Then he began to speak, his voice low and slow, as though he were reading a page he had kept locked away in a drawer for 9 years. "That night, my father was attacked on the steps of the estate. Not inside the house, not somewhere distant, but right there on the granite steps he had walked across for 40 years of his life. He tried to drag himself to the door. I do not know how far he managed to crawl, but I know that when the night steward found him, he was only a few meters from the main entrance. He was still conscious. He called my name before he died. I was 24 at the time. I was in New York for a deal that did not matter. A deal my father told me I did not need to attend, but I went anyway." He lifted the glass, took a slow sip, then set it down. "I flew back that same night. I arrived at dawn. I saw him lying on a stone table in the family's private hospital morgue. From that night on, I hunted every man connected to his life for 3 years. 17 names. 17 men. One by one I found them. I asked my questions. I demanded answers. Some spoke, some did not. But every time I finished with one, every time I walked away, I knew one thing. I had not reached the one who truly stood behind it all." Rafael placed the glass down. Those 17 men were only arms. The one behind them never showed his face. The room fell into silence, filled only by the layered ticking of the clocks around them. Ren raised her glass, took a small sip, then set it down. She looked at Rafael across the lamplight, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft it was almost only breath. "Because he is still sitting in the dark." Rafael lifted his gaze. This time, his eyes met hers not with assessment as in the beginning, not with observation as in the evenings. He stood at the doorway. This time, it was the look of a man who had just realized the person sitting across from him might know something he had been searching for 9 years. "You know something." Ren did not deny it. She did not answer immediately either. She picked up the wooden box carved with sparrows that always rested beside her, her fingers brushing lightly over the fine engraving of the bird's wings. And then she spoke. "Before my father died, he found a name. He never told me that name. He only told me that if one day I became desperate enough to have nowhere left to go, I should bring this box to a man named Rafael Varga. I have always believed that if the day ever came when I placed this box before you, it would be because of that name he found." She lifted her eyes to him. "And I do not believe in coincidence." Rafael looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his glass again, but did not drink. He set it back down without a sound. "Then we will find it together." The next morning, Ren woke earlier than usual. She did not go straight to the room in the north wing. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, the wooden box carved with sparrows resting on her lap, her fingertips tracing lightly along the engraved wings of the small bird. Through the night, after Rafael had left the clock room and the unfinished glass of red wine remained on the work table, she had lain in her room staring at the ceiling for a very long time. She had asked herself a simple question she had never asked in 9 years. Why had her father told her to bring this box? Not the photograph, not the watch, but the box. She stood, slipped her sweater over her white cotton shirt, and carried the box straight to the clock room. But this morning she did not go to the French wall clock she had meant to repair the day before. She walked directly to the white-covered work table at the center of the room, set the box down, and opened it. The gold pocket watch lay there, silent as always, the engraved letters A and V still catching the light beneath the desk lamp. She had not touched this watch since the night she placed it on the black marble counter at the Obsidian Club. She set the magnifier over her eye, chose the smallest screwdriver from her tool case, and lifted the watch into her hand. She opened the back first, gently, like opening the first page of an old book, revealing the mechanism inside. The movement remained intact, the tiny brass gears dulled by a thin layer of dust but not damaged. She brushed them lightly, then began to dismantle each piece, laying them in order on the green felt beside her. She removed the second hand, the minute hand, the hour hand, then lifted the dial. When the dial came free, she turned it over out of habit, the habit of a careful clockmaker, and in that instant her fingers stilled. The back of the dial was not flat as it should have been. At the center, where the hour pin passed through, there was a faint line, so thin it was nearly invisible, forming a small circular outline no larger than a coin. It was not a machining mark, it was a seam. She brought it closer to the magnifier, her heartbeat slowing for a single beat. She took the finest screwdriver from her tools, placed its tip against the line, and turned it gently. A soft click answered. The layer of brass lifted away, revealing a hidden compartment no deeper than a folded letter. And inside it, there was a piece of paper. Wren did not breathe for several seconds. She set the dial down, used her tweezers to lift the paper carefully from its hidden place. The paper had yellowed, its folds worn at the edges, but it remained intact. She unfolded it slowly, afraid it might tear. Inside was handwriting belonging to a man she had never met, yet she recognized it immediately, because among her father's old papers, there had been a letter sent from Savannah written in the exact same hand. If you are reading this, I am gone. Elijah holds the rest. The traitor is O.L. Only 4 lines, but each line was written with the hand of a man who knew he had little time left. Wren held the paper for a length of time she could no longer measure. Then she stood. She did not remove the magnifier from her eye. She did not turn off the lamp. She did not put away her tools. She walked out of the clock room, down the north wing corridor, descended the main staircase, and went straight to Raphael's study. She did not knock. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Raphael sat behind his desk, a gold-plated fountain pen in his hand, as he signed a set of documents. He looked up when she entered, and the moment he saw her expression, he set the pen down immediately. Wren walked straight to the desk and placed the paper before him. It was inside the back of the dial. Raphael did not respond. He picked up the paper and read. He read it once, then again, then a third time, and with each reading his eyes darkened further. When he set it down, he did not look at Wren. He looked at the final letters, O.L., and spoke them softly, almost to himself. O.L. Then he pressed the bell beneath his desk. Less than a minute later, Silvano entered the study. He had long learned the difference between an ordinary summons and one that meant the world was about to shift, and this morning he moved faster than usual even with his cane. Raphael said nothing. He slid the paper across the desk toward him. Silvano placed his cane against the desk, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, and bent to read. He read it once, his face drained of color in stages, from forehead to cheek to jaw, as though something were being drawn out of him line by line. When he looked up, his voice had grown hoarse. That is impossible. Raphael did not lift his gaze from the desk. He spoke a name, flat and deliberate, as if placing it upon an operating table. Osric Landon. Silvano leaned against the desk to steady himself. He looked down at the paper again, then at Raphael, then toward the window, then toward the large portrait of Aron Varga hanging on the far wall, the man who had sat at the same table as his father for 4 decades, the man who had carried his father's coffin. Raphael gave a small nod. That is why he could come close enough. The room fell into a long silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock in the corner. One Wren had repaired the day before. Then Raphael turned to her. Your father said there is more. Do you know where he hid it? Raphael's question hung in the room like a blade waiting to be drawn. Wren stood still at the edge of the desk, looking down at the wooden box she still held in her arms, and for a brief moment, a distant memory she had not touched in years rose clear, as if it had happened only yesterday. She was 12 years old. An autumn afternoon in the small workshop behind their house on the outskirts of Savannah, her father sitting at his workbench, the yellow light falling over his calloused hands as he carefully repaired a glass cabinet clock for a customer. Wren stood beside him, watching the tiny gears arranged on the green, felt with quiet curiosity. Then suddenly he stopped, removed the magnifier from his eye, and turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen before, something she had not understood at the time, only knowing it was different from every look he had ever given her. He handed her a small wooden box, polished smooth, the lid carved with a sparrow spreading its wings. He spoke, his voice low and gentle. "This is yours. Never lose it. It is your last way out." She had not understood those words at 12. She had placed the box in her drawer, sometimes taking it out to look at the gold pocket watch inside, and as she grew older, she carried it with her as a keepsake. She believed valuable only because it had belonged to her father, but she had never examined it as closely as she did now. She lifted her head. Rafael and Silvano were watching her, waiting. "Perhaps," she said softly. She set the wooden box down on Rafael's desk, turned it over, and ran her fingers along the base. The bottom edges of the box were rounded and covered with a thin layer of worn brown leather. She had always believed that layer was simply to protect the wood from scratches when placed on surfaces. But this morning, when she pressed lightly at the center of the base, she felt a slight hollow. She took the smallest screwdriver from her toolkit, carefully slipped its tip into the edge, and the leather lifted away from the wooden base, revealing a shallow compartment no deeper than half a finger. Inside were 2 items: a small steel key, oddly shaped with uneven serrations, the kind used for private safe deposit boxes in banks, and a small folded piece of paper, on which her father had written in black pencil a single line: Charleston Private Trust Bank, Deposit Room 027. Silvano drew in a quiet breath. Rafael said nothing. He simply stood, took his black coat from the back of the chair, and walked out. 10 minutes later, 2 black Bentleys waited at the gates of Ravenhurst, engines humming softly in the night. Rafael, Ren, Silvano, Tobias, and 2 guards took their places. Ren sat in the back seat of the first car beside Rafael, the wooden box resting on her lap, the key held in her palm. The convoy left Savannah at 4 o'clock in the morning, speeding along the coastal highway through thick darkness, headlights cutting across rows of ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, like strands of silver hair swaying in the wind. No one spoke. The guards in front remained silent. Silvano in the second car remained silent, and inside the first Bentley, Ren and Rafael were silent as well. Ren leaned her head against the cool glass, her eyes fixed on the darkness moving past outside. She did not know what she felt, only that something heavy as stone sat within her chest, and it was not fear but a tension stretched tight like a drawn string. After a long while, Rafael's voice came beside her, low, without turning toward her. "What are you afraid of?" She did not look at him. She answered softly and slowly, "That what my father hid will prove he was not the man I believed he was." Rafael was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice still steady, but something softer beneath it. "Or it will prove he was exactly who you believed. And that may hurt even more." Ren turned her head. For the first time in 3 days at Ravenhurst, she looked at him not as a lord, not as a man giving her shelter, not as a stranger who had touched her shoulder in the clock room. She looked at him as a person who had lived through 9 winters carrying the same kind of weight she had carried. He did not look back. He kept his gaze forward, but Ren knew he had felt it. She turned back to the window and slipped the key into her coat pocket. No one spoke for the rest of the journey. When the convoy stopped at Charleston Private Trust Bank, dawn was beginning to break. A manager in a black suit was waiting at the entrance. He led them down into the basement, through 2 layers of steel doors, into a large room arranged like a library, with walls lined by rows of numbered brass safe deposit boxes. He stopped at box number 027, stepped back, and allowed Ren to move forward. She inserted the key into the lock, turned it gently. The lock released with a dry click. She pulled the long steel tray out and placed it on the table at the center of the room. Everyone gathered around. Inside the tray were 3 items. A worn brown leather notebook, thick, its pages curved from age, Elijah's handwriting filling its pages, the cover marked with a small symbol, a sparrow. Beside it, an old handheld recorder, the kind that used small cassette tapes, yellowed by time but still holding a tape within, and beneath them, resting on black velvet, a heavy paper envelope sealed with red wax stamped with a sparrow. On its front, in Elijah's handwriting, a single line: "For Rafael Varga." Rafael lifted the envelope. He did not open it immediately. He held it in his hand, and for the first time since the night Ren stepped into Obsidian, she heard his breathing slow by a single measure. The convoy returned to Ravenhurst before the sun had fully risen above the horizon. The eastern sky had begun to turn a pale orange pink as the 2 Bentleys rolled through the iron gates. Yet inside the estate, every light remained on. Cordelia was already waiting in the main hall, her hands folded before her, and when she saw Rafael step in, she simply led everyone straight up to the study without a word. Garrett had prepared hot coffee and freshly baked bread on a side table. No one touched either of them. Rafael placed the worn brown leather notebook on the large oak desk. He set the old handheld recorder beside it. He placed the envelope sealed with red wax, stamped with a sparrow last, aligned perfectly with the other two. Then he straightened, his back still turned to everyone, and said nothing for a moment. Silvano lowered himself into the nearest armchair, setting his cane against the armrest. Cordelia stood by the door, unmoving. Tobias stood behind them, silent as a shadow. Wren stepped closer to the desk. She picked up the recorder, turned it in her hand, and noticed the old-style jack at its base that could be connected to a speaker. On the bookshelf behind Raphael's desk stood an antique wooden speaker, and Cordelia quietly stepped forward to connect the wire for her. Wren set the recorder at the center of the desk. She glanced at Raphael. He gave a small nod. She pressed play. For the first second, there was only the faint static of an old tape turning on its head, the soft friction of metal against metal after 9 years of silence. Then a voice emerged. It was deep, warm, and carried a slight trailing cadence at the end of each sentence. It was Aron Varga's voice. Silvano drew in a long breath and closed his eyes for half a second. Cordelia gripped the back of a nearby chair. Raphael did not move. He remained standing, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him, his head slightly bowed to catch every word. Aaron's voice continued, responding to a conversation that had begun before the tape had been turned on. He was answering another man, and that man spoke slowly, his voice rough with the texture of someone who had smoked Cuban cigars for many years. Aaron, we have walked together for 40 years. I am not asking for much. Half the port, half the southern roots. I will let you keep the rest. We will still be brothers. A brief silence. Then Aaron's voice came again, not raised, not angry, only flat as a blade. Osric, you knew my answer before you came here tonight. If I agree to split anything with you, I will no longer be the man you have called brother for 40 years. And if you try to force me, I will hand every record Elijah has kept for me over the past 2 decades to the federal authorities tomorrow morning. You know what I mean. You know what Elijah has. A dry laugh from Osric. A long exhale. Then his voice again, lower now, as though he had made his decision. Then I came here for nothing. The sound of shoes shifting across stone. A short silence. Then a sharp crack split the air, brief and final, rattling the glass of the antique speaker. What followed was the sound of something collapsing, the shatter of a glass hitting stone, footsteps moving away in haste, and then, in the final 10 seconds of the tape, there was only one sound left, breathing, slow, broken, each breath shorter than the last, until there was nothing. The tape turned for a few more seconds in silence, then stopped on its own. No one spoke. Silvano lowered his head, his aged hand gripping the top of his cane. Cordelia turned her face toward the wall. Tobias stood with his eyes closed. Raphael still did not turn. Then, after a long stretch of time, he sat down behind the desk for the first time that night and pulled the red sealed envelope toward himself. He used a letter opener to cut it carefully, preserving the wax seal. Inside were 2 pages, aged with time, Elijah Caldwell's handwriting filling both sides. He read aloud, his voice low and steady, just enough for everyone in the room to hear. If you are reading this, it means my daughter has reached you. It means I am gone. You would not have believed me if I had sent this while I was alive. You would have thought I was trying to arrange something, or that fear had made me imagine things that were not there. I know you, Raphael. I have known you since you were 7 years old, running through your father's yard. That is why I chose this way. If my daughter has brought the watch to you, then fate itself has confirmed that I was right. Only then would you read these words. Your father did not die because of a territorial dispute, nor because of an outside enemy. He died because of the man who sat beside him for 40 years, the man he loved like a brother. I know this because I recorded everything over 20 years while repairing clocks for both families, and I listened. I am not a special man. I am only a clockmaker, but in my workshop, men like you forget that someone bent over a workbench still has ears. Raphael paused, then continued. Protect my daughter. She knows nothing of your world, but she carries everything my father taught me, and everything your father taught you. It is the clock that never stops, even when the hands that hold it have stopped. If one day you see it beating again in her hands, you will understand why I trusted her. And I know you will do what is right." Rafael folded the letter slowly, carefully, as though folding something that might turn to dust if handled too roughly. He placed it at the center of the desk. Then he lifted his gaze and turned to Ren. "Your father and mine were friends, not partners, not allies, true friends. Did you know that?" Ren could not answer for a moment. She looked at the letter on the desk, at her father's handwriting, at the small sparrow symbol he always drew at the end of anything he signed. She shook her head very slightly. And for the first time in all of this, for the first time in 4 long months, for the first time since the night she climbed out the second-floor window and ran into the darkness of a life with no one left, a single warm tear slipped from the corner of her eye, traced down her cheek, and fell onto the oak desk beside the letter of the father she had lost. 3 days passed after the night the tape had been played in the study, and in those 3 days Ravenhurst shifted into a state that those who lived inside quietly called the Black State. No one spoke it aloud, yet everyone knew. The guards at the front gates had doubled. Every vehicle entering or leaving was checked at the wooden post along the drive. Cordelia had moved all critical records down to the basement level. Silvano had cut his communications short, using only a single new phone that had never been registered. Rafael had canceled 2 important meetings at the port and 3 diplomatic dinners with partners in Atlanta without offering a single explanation. And in the clock room in the north wing, Ren continued her work, but now every 2 hours a guard would pass along the corridor to check the door. On Wednesday morning, Tobias drove out to the outskirts of Savannah to purchase a batch of specialized machine oil from a supplier the Varga family had trusted for decades. On his way back, he stopped at a small gas station at the edge of the city, the kind with only 2 pumps and a small convenience store selling snacks. He pulled up to the second pump, stepped out, and at that moment, he saw him. About 10 meters away, at the counter inside the store, a man leaned slightly forward, holding out his phone to a young cashier. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair cut short, wearing a brown leather jacket and dark jeans. From the angle, Tobias could only see half of his face, but Cordelia had shown him the file 2 days earlier, and Tobias never forgot a face once he had seen it. He pulled out his own phone, pretended to check a receipt, and took 3 quick photos through the glass at an angle where the image was clear, but he would not be noticed. In the frame, he caught another detail. On the man's belt, beneath the edge of his jacket, there was the faint glint of a round brass badge from the Savannah Police Department. And in his other hand was a document with the official header of the Savannah Police Department, a format Tobias had seen too many times to mistake. Tobias sent all 3 photos to Silvano with a single message. Colfax Station. Right now, Silvano read the message in Rafael's study. He handed the phone to Rafael without a word. Rafael studied the images, enlarged the second one, then set the phone down. His face did not change, but Silvano knew this young man well enough to understand that the storm had begun. Cordelia was summoned to the study within 5 minutes. Rafael did not speak much. He gave only 3 short orders. Increase security at every entrance. Ren does not leave the estate under any circumstance. Prepare a private room in the east wing for Beatrice. Cordelia nodded, turned to leave, then paused at the door. She turned back. Rafael, I have one matter to attend outside this morning. A scheduled appointment with my physician from 2 weeks ago. I cannot cancel it without drawing attention. Rafael watched her for 2 beats, then nodded. Take a family car. Tobias follows at a distance. Do not remain out longer than 1 hour. Cordelia left Ravenhurst at 10 in the morning, seated in the back of a black Lincoln with privacy glass, driven by one of the longest-serving drivers of the Varga family. Tobias followed behind in a Mercedes, keeping a safe distance. Her appointment in the city center lasted exactly 30 minutes, and when she stepped out of the clinic and walked along a short block to pick up a small prescription from her usual pharmacy, she believed she would return to Ravenhurst without incident. She was wrong. She had just pushed open the pharmacy door and stepped onto the sidewalk, a small paper bag in her hand, when a figure broke from the passing crowd and moved directly in front of her. Hello, do you have a minute? Cordelia lifted her head, and those bright blue eyes were the same ones she had seen on the screen 2 nights before. She did not flinch. She offered a polite smile, the exact kind a busy middle-aged woman would give a stranger, stopping her on the street. I am in a hurry. but go ahead. Make it quick. Wyatt Crane held out his phone. On the screen was a photograph of Wren, taken from over her shoulder while she stood in the kitchen of the house she had fled 4 days before reaching Savannah. Have you seen this woman? She is my fiancée. She is suffering from a severe mental condition and left home without her medication. I tracked her to Savannah, but lost her trail here. If you see anyone resembling her, please contact me immediately. Her life may depend on it. Cordelia looked at the image. She furrowed her brow slightly, leaned in as if examining it closely, then shook her head. She looks unfortunate, but I am afraid I have not seen her. I have only been in this area for 3 months. If I do, I promise I will call you. Do you have a card? Wyatt smiled, took a white business card from his inner pocket, and handed it to her. Thank you. Cordelia accepted it, glanced at it as a matter of courtesy, and slipped it into her bag beside the medication. I wish you luck, she said, her voice as calm as water, then turned and walked away. She did not hurry. She did not run. She walked at the exact pace of a woman who had just finished an errand. Not a step faster, not a step slower. She did not look back. When she entered the Lincoln and the door closed, she did not check the rearview mirror even once. She simply said to the driver, her voice steady, "Back to Ravenhurst. Do not stop anywhere." 15 minutes later, she stepped into the main hall of the estate, closed the heavy oak doors behind her, and only when she heard the latch fall into place did she allow herself to release a long breath. She walked straight into Raphael's study, and when he looked up, she placed the white card on his desk. He is closing in. He was spotted in the same district as our medical clinic. Raphael looked at the card. He did not touch it. He reached instead for the phone on his desk, dialed a single number, and when a woman's calm voice answered on the other end, he spoke, his tone flat and final, leaving no room for hesitation. "Beatrice, fly to Savannah tonight. I need the best lawyer in the Southeast at Ravenhurst before dawn." Beatrice Sullivan arrived in Savannah on the Varga family's private jet that same night, and when she stepped onto the grounds of Ravenhurst, the clock had already passed 11 o'clock. She was a woman of 52, short in stature but standing perfectly straight. Her hair cut short and streaked with silver and white. Her brown eyes sharp as whetstones behind thin metal-framed glasses. She entered the hall carrying a worn black leather briefcase, offered no polite greeting, declined the glass of water Cordelia held out, and asked only one brief question: "Where is the file?" Raphael led her into the large meeting room on the first floor. Cordelia had arranged everything on the long table. Elijah's leather notebook at the head, the old recorder with its cassette beside it, the handwritten letter sealed inside a clear protective sleeve, a thick folder containing Wyatt Crane's file at the center, the white business card Cordelia had obtained placed separately in an envelope, and at the far end, the digital medical records Cordelia's team had intercepted from hospital servers, showing every visit she made over the years. Beatrice removed her coat, sat down, and began to read. For the next 2 hours, she did not speak. She turned each page, made notes in red pencil in her own leather notebook, paused at details, sometimes gave a slight nod, sometimes raised a single brow. When she finished listening to the cassette through her headphones, she removed them and sat very still for a long time, looking straight at the wall ahead. Then she asked for Wren. Wren entered wearing a thick gray sweater, her hair tied neatly back. She sat across from Beatrice. Beatrice did not look at the file again. She looked directly at Wren through her thin framed glasses and spoke in a low, direct voice. "Miss Caldwell, if we bring this case to the FBI, they will not investigate only those 2 men. They will investigate you. They will dig through every part of your life from the time you were a child. They will ask about your father, your mother, every home you have lived in. They will interview former neighbors, former classmates, every doctor who has ever treated you. They will find details even you may have forgotten, and defense attorneys will use every one of those details to try to make you seem unreliable. Are you prepared for them to uncover the worst parts of your life?" Wren did not answer immediately. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap for a few seconds. Then she lifted her gaze to Beatrice. "I have lived through all of it. Telling it is not more frightening." Beatrice nodded slowly. She did not smile, but something in her eyes softened. She turned to Raphael standing at the end of the room. "Good. We take this to the FBI, not state court. The federal agency has jurisdiction over interstate corruption and organized crime. They will not be entangled in Crane's local connections. I have a contact in the Atlanta office. I will call him tonight. Rafael nodded. After Cordelia escorted Beatrice to her room in the east wing, Rafael summoned Silvano and Tobias into the study. He closed the door. He did not offer them seats. He spoke quickly and clearly. Tomorrow we take Ren to FBI headquarters in Atlanta to testify in person. Beatrice has arranged it, but I do not believe we will reach Atlanta without trouble. If I were Crane, I would attempt to intercept our convoy using a false warrant to take Ren before we ever reach court. So we will deny him that chance in the simplest way possible. We will turn his false warrant into public evidence. He turned to Tobias. You handle the live stream. 3 major media platforms in the Southeast, plus 2 national channels. Beatrice will provide the contacts. The moment we are stopped, you activate all 5 simultaneously, with no delay. 1 camera on the rearview mirror of the lead car, the second on your jacket. Check the signal one last time before departure. Tobias nodded without speaking. Rafael turned to Silvano. You send copies of the tape, Elijah's notebook, and the letter to the FBI Atlanta office tonight, through Beatrice's encrypted channel. When we arrive in the morning, they must already have the original file. If anything happens on the road, at least the evidence is safe. Silvano bowed his head once. Rafael remained standing for a moment longer, then spoke more quietly. Get some rest. We leave at 6 in the morning. When the study emptied, the clock on the mantel read nearly 3 o'clock. Ravenhurst sank into the peculiar silence of a late night before a storm, but in the north wing, the yellow glow of a desk lamp still burned inside the clockroom. Ren could not sleep. She had tried to lie down for half an hour, eyes closed, but her heart would not settle into any rhythm, and finally she rose, put on her sweater, and went straight to the room in the north wing. She sat at the white-covered work table, placed the magnifier over her eye, and took out the last wristwatch that had not yet been repaired in the collection. It was the watch Cordelia had said Aron Varga had worn every day for the last 15 years of his life. The dial was scratched, the leather strap stiff, but the movement inside remained intact. She began to work. In silence, the ticking of more than 100 clocks around her rose softly like a chorus, drawing her into focus. She did not hear the footsteps entering the room. She only became aware when a chair was pulled out across from her, and someone sat down. Rafael rested both elbows on the table, fingers interlaced. No glass of wine, no cigar, only himself. She did not look up at once. She fitted another gear into place. Then she removed the magnifier, set it down, and looked at him. The room held a long silence. The lamp cast a warm circle of light between them, while beyond it the rest of the room lay in gentle shadow. Then Rafael spoke, his voice lower than usual. After tomorrow, no matter the outcome, I want you to know something. She did not look away. She waited. You do not have to run anymore. This place is yours. If you wish to leave after everything is finished, I will not stop you. But if you choose to stay, he paused. It was the kind of pause only a man who had lived 9 years in silence could understand. A pause he had never known how to fill with anyone in his life until this moment. Then this will be your home. Always. Ren did not answer immediately. She lowered her gaze, placed the wristwatch she had just repaired on the wooden table between them. She wound it carefully, then released it. The second hand began to move, and a soft ticking rose, steady and sure like a heartbeat. Aron Varga's watch was alive again after 9 years. Ren lifted her eyes. The lamp's light touched one side of her face, leaving the other in shadow. I do not know if I am capable of loving anyone again, she said, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the ticking. But I know I do not want to leave. Rafael did not move. He did not reach for her. He did not speak again. He simply sat there across the table, less than a meter apart, looking at her with black eyes that for the first time in 9 years held nothing back. Time slowed in a way that felt almost unreal. Outside the window, the darkness thinned. A line of pale blue-gray appeared in the east, then softened into pink, then into a faint gold. The first light of that day, the day that would decide both their fates, slipped through the window of the north wing room and spread across the wooden table between them, across the small watch ticking steadily, across 2 hands that did not touch, but lay only centimeters apart. They remained there in that golden light. Neither moved, neither needed to, because in that room, in that moment, the 2 of them were closer than they had been in all the years before combined. On that same night, while in Ravenhurst 2 people sat in silence within the warm yellow light of the clockroom, somewhere else in Savannah, Inside an abandoned warehouse by the river, where dark water slid quietly past rotting wooden pillars, another meeting unfolded, beneath a single, flickering, fluorescent light hanging from the ceiling. The man standing at the center of the warehouse was 60 years old, his silver hair combed straight back, dressed in an expensive charcoal gray cashmere coat, his Italian leather shoes still untouched by dirt despite the dust covering the floor. It was Osric Landon. He was not afraid. He had not been afraid in 40 years, living in the underworld of the American Southeast, but his gray eyes beneath the yellow light had turned to a colder shade, sharp enough that even the man standing across from him stepped back half a pace. Wyatt Crane had removed his brown leather jacket, standing now in a gray shirt with a light ballistic vest beneath it. The police badge still hung from his belt, and in his hand was a fully stamped false arrest warrant. Osric looked at the paper for a single second, then raised his gaze to Wyatt. The girl does not go to court. She does not testify. She does not speak a single word to any federal authority. You understand what I mean? Wyatt nodded. I have a valid warrant. I have 3 officers with me. We stop the convoy on the road to Atlanta, take her under the pretext of mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Once she is in my custody, no one will be able to take her back. Osric watched him for a long time. Rafael Varga is not a fool, young man. He already knows you have been in Savannah for 2 days. He called a lawyer down overnight. He will anticipate every scenario we can create. 4 officers are not enough. Wyatt licked his lips. Then we need more. Osric did not answer immediately. He turned toward a man standing quietly in the corner of the warehouse, a figure in a heavy black coat, head shaved, face expressionless. The man gave a single nod. Within 20 minutes, 6 more men had been summoned. Men without badges, without records, without names in any public database. 2 black SUVs were checked for fuel, for weapons, for radios. The plan was laid out on an old map, spread across the top of an oil drum. The only route the Varga convoy would take to reach the highway toward Atlanta was the narrow road running along the Savannah River, bordered on one side by abandoned warehouses and on the other by the dark water, a stretch with no cameras, no houses, no traffic at dawn. 7 o'clock. At Ravenhurst, at 4 in the morning, Silvano knocked on Raphael's study door. In his hand was a set of images just printed from the estate's surveillance system. Throughout the night, a dark SUV had parked approximately 300 meters from the estate gate near a dead end, shifting position 3 times to avoid detection, yet the Varga family's infrared cameras had captured all 3 movements. Raphael looked at the photographs for only a few seconds. He turned to the private phone on his desk and dialed Beatrice through an encrypted line. She answered after a single ring. They are outside, Raphael said evenly. I need the FBI to trail our convoy from Ravenhurst, keep enough distance not to be detected, and be ready to intervene the moment Tobias activates the live stream. Beatrice did not question him. I will call them now. At 6:55 in the morning, 3 cars were already positioned on the stone courtyard before the main entrance, 2 black Bentleys at the front and rear, and a reinforced 6-door black Mercedes with bullet-resistant glass in the middle. Wren stepped out from the hall wearing a light gray suit Cordelia had brought to her room, her hair tied neatly at the nape, carrying only a small leather wallet. In her coat pocket, the gold pocket watch, marked AV, was wrapped in a silk cloth, the only item she wished to carry to her testimony. Raphael stepped out 3 seconds behind her, wearing his long black coat, black tie, the raven head ring still resting on his left pinky finger. He opened the rear door of the Mercedes for her, let her enter first, then followed and sat beside her. Cordelia stood at the steps and gave a single nod. Silvano took his place in the lead Bentley. Tobias sat in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes, phone already connected to the live broadcast system in his hand. The engines started in unison. As the Mercedes rolled through the estate gates, Raphael did not look out the window. He looked down at Wren's hands resting on her lap, her fingers lightly tightening together. He extended his right hand and placed it gently over the back of her left hand. A single touch, no pressure, no interlocking fingers, just resting there for the span of 3 breaths. No matter what happens, stay in the car. Do not step out. Wren gave a small nod. She said nothing. Raphael withdrew his hand. The convoy left Ravenhurst under the early morning sunlight, casting gold over the gray stone walls. Savannah's streets were nearly empty at that hour. Only a few newspaper cyclists at intersections. A street cleaning vehicle moving slowly through the historic district. The Bentleys and Mercedes glided along the wide avenues, turned down the road toward the industrial riverfront, speed steady, distance maintained. Inside the Mercedes, no one spoke. Ren looked straight ahead through the windshield. Tobias checked the signal one last time. Rafael leaned back in his seat, but his eyes did not rest. And then, as the convoy entered the narrow road along the Savannah River, bordered by a line of abandoned warehouses on the right and dark water on the left, two black SUVs suddenly surged out from opposite sides of the road, cutting across in a V formation that blocked both lanes entirely, forcing the Varga convoy to brake sharply and come to a halt in the empty road under the pale early morning light. The two black SUVs lay angled across the narrow riverside road, forming a closed iron V, and in the instant the Varga convoy's Mercedes braked to a sharp halt. The only sounds were tires grinding against asphalt and the distant cry of crows from across the river. The doors of both SUVs opened at once. 6 men stepped out, 4 to the sides, 2 in the center, all in dark coats, gloved hands, none speaking a word. At the center, advancing between them, was Wyatt Crane. He had changed into the dark blue uniform of the Savannah Police Department, the gold badge fixed neatly on his left chest, the false warrant held in his right hand, his service weapon still resting in its holster at his side. He stopped 4 meters from the Mercedes. "I have a warrant to detain Wren Caldwell for endangering herself and others due to acute mental instability. Bring her out, now." The rear door of the Mercedes opened. Rafael Varga stepped out, unhurried, not looking at Wyatt at once. He buttoned his black coat, adjusted the collar, and only then slowly lifted his gaze. At the same time, from the 2 Bentleys at the front and rear, 8 men of the Varga family stepped out, spreading into a curved line around the Mercedes, each with one hand resting inside his suit jacket, not drawing anything, yet everyone knew what was there. Rafael walked 3 steps forward, stopping in the center of the road, and looked directly at Wyatt. "Your warrant holds no authority in this territory." Wyatt gave a dry laugh. "This is America, Varga. No one owns territory here." Rafael let the words hang between them for 2 beats, before the corner of his mouth lifted slightly into a smile Wyatt would later see again in his cell, in restless nights. It was the coldest smile he had ever witnessed. "Savannah is my territory. Every street, every building, every stone in the road. And every officer you think you can call here this morning, I can tell you in advance, none of them will stand with you. Not one." In that moment, from the passenger seat of the Mercedes, Tobias touched the screen of his phone. 3 live stream platforms lit up simultaneously. One from the largest news outlet in the Southeast, one from a federal broadcast channel Beatrice had contacted overnight, one from a social platform with nearly 200 million users across the United States. The camera mounted on the rearview mirror of the lead Bentley captured the entire scene head-on. The second camera clipped to Tobias's jacket recorded Wyatt's profile and the 6 men surrounding him. The viewer count surged within 30 seconds, but Wyatt did not know. Rafael continued, his voice rising just enough for every microphone to capture each word clearly. "Officer Wyatt Crane, I want you to listen carefully. We have evidence proving that 9 years ago, on the night of November 7th, you were responsible for the death of Elijah Caldwell at his own home, outskirts of Savannah. We have detailed records. We have an audio recording of the conversation between Aron Varga and Osric Landon on the night my father died, in which Osric ordered the entire operation. We have banking records showing you received regular quarterly transfers over 9 years from a shell company owned by Osric Landon. And everything I am saying now is being broadcast live on 3 platforms to millions of American citizens." Wyatt's face drained of color in stages. He glanced left and right. The 6 men beside him had stopped moving. One had already stepped back. Wyatt's right hand reflexively dropped the warrant and moved toward his holstered gun. But at that exact instant, Rafael's 8 men shifted in unison, their hands emerging from their jackets, and Wyatt understood that any next movement would be his last. His hand froze on the grip. He did not draw. He did not lower it. He simply stood there, eyes fixed on Rafael, and Rafael stood still, expression unmoving. Then, from the far end of the road came the sound of sirens. Another echoed from across the river. 6 black pickup trucks and 3 suburban vehicles from the Federal Bureau of Investigation rushed in from both ends, sealing off the road Wyatt had believed deserted. Agents in black tactical gear with gold lettering across their chests advanced in formation, weapons raised, voices cutting through the morning air. "Get on your knees. Hands on your head. Now, Wyatt's men, untrained compared to the Varga family, obeyed immediately. 2 were on their knees before the command was repeated. Only Wyatt remained standing, his hand still on his weapon, his face completely drained. An agent approached from behind, removed the gun from his holster, and pulled his hands behind his back, securing them in cuffs. Wyatt did not resist. He did not speak. At the same moment, roughly 16 kilometers to the north, at Osric Landon's estate outside Savannah, a second FBI team completed their raid. They had surrounded the property since 5 in the morning, waiting for the signal, and when it came through Beatrice's line, they entered from 3 directions at once. Osric Landon sat in a small dining room, a cup of black coffee still steaming on the table, waiting for Wyatt's call of success. That call would never come. He lifted his head as the door burst open and met the eyes of the lead agent. He said nothing. He placed his spoon quietly onto the saucer, as though he had long known this day would arrive, only never knowing which morning it would be. Back on the Riverside Road, as Wyatt was led toward the FBI vehicle, the rear door of the Mercedes opened again. Wren stepped out. She stood upright beneath the early sunlight, her light gray suit perfectly smooth, her hair neatly tied back. She did not run forward. She did not cry. She did not reach out. She simply stood there, 7 meters from the police vehicle, watching the man who had locked her in a second-floor bedroom 4 months earlier, the man responsible for her father's death, the man who had brought flowers to her father's grave 6 months after that night and then pursued her. She watched as he was pushed into the back seat of a black Suburban. She watched the door close. She watched the vehicle start and roll away. Inside her chest there were no tears, no triumph, only a vast stillness, the stillness of someone who, after years of looking over her shoulder, was finally allowed to stand still. Rafael came to stand beside her, as quietly as he always did. He said nothing. He simply removed his black outer coat and placed it over her shoulders, drawing the lapels together gently at her chest. The morning light spread across the Savannah River in a thin golden sheet, and in that light the 2 of them stood side by side on the narrow road, not touching, not holding, simply standing. And for the first time that morning, Wren took a deep breath and let it go, releasing something she had held inside her for 9 long years. 6 weeks had passed since that morning on the narrow road along the Savannah River. The federal courthouse in Atlanta stood beneath a cold, late January sky, a thin layer of frost covering the stone ground outside, its white columns rising against a dull gray horizon. Inside courtroom number 4, every seat in the gallery was filled, reporters from more than a dozen news agencies occupying the front rows, and behind the thick glass of the defendant's bench, 2 men who had shaped the fate of countless lives over 9 years now sat separated by a single empty chair. Osric Landon was charged by the United States Department of Justice with 3 major counts: conspiracy to orchestrate the death of Aron Varga, operating a multi-state criminal enterprise for over 2 decades, and federal-level corruption through bribery of law enforcement officials across 3 southeastern states. Wyatt Crane was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Elijah Caldwell. Multiple counts of domestic abuse against Wren Caldwell spanning nearly 9 years, and abuse of police authority for personal gain. When Wren was called to testify on the 3rd day, she walked slowly but upright, wearing a simple light gray suit with no jewelry, her hair neatly tied back, the only thing around her neck, a thin silver chain Cordelia had given her that morning. Her voice when she began was steady, clear, without tremor. She spoke of her father, the watchmaker who raised her in a small wooden house outside Savannah, of his worn hands and the quiet afternoons he taught her how to take apart her first tiny gears. She spoke of his funeral when she had just turned 18, of the day a young man with a police badge and a bouquet of white chrysanthemums appeared at her door and began what she then believed was care. She spoke of how her first love slowly turned into a nightmare lasting nearly 9 years, of the emergency rooms she visited with stories no one had time to question. She spoke of her mother who did not survive the grief of losing her husband and passed away as her mental health worsened 6 months after the funeral. And then came the moment that would later be replayed across countless broadcasts. When Wyatt's defense attorney stood, adjusted his tie, approached the witness stand, and asked in a drawn-out tone, "Miss Caldwell, I must ask the question everyone here wants answered. Why did you trust a mafia boss more than your own police fiancé?" Wren did not look at his client. She looked directly at the lawyer, her gray-blue eyes calm and bright like a winter lake. Because that mafia boss looked at me and saw a person, while my police fiancé looked at me and saw something he could own. The courtroom fell silent. When the verdict was delivered after 3 days of jury deliberation, Osric Landon received life imprisonment without parole. Wyatt Crane received 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 30 years. 2 months later, Ravenhurst welcomed its first spring after 9 long years. The southern garden of the estate, where Aron Varga once walked each morning, had been restored by Cordelia and Garrett throughout the winter. The rare black roses Aron had planted long before Raphael was born had not bloomed since the winter of his death. Yet in the final week of March that year, the first buds appeared, deep crimson, almost black under the afternoon sun, releasing a soft fragrance along the marble pathways. Within the estate grounds, a short walk from the iron gates, a small shop had been completed during the winter. It was a 1-story wooden house with a red-tiled roof, clear glass windows, and above the entrance, a sign carved from walnut wood bore 2 names, Caldwell and Varga timepieces. Inside, warm golden light glowed from overhead lamps, the scent of machine oil mingling with fresh wood. And along both walls stood shelves of restored watches, from 19th century pocket pieces to discontinued wristwatches of long-forgotten makers. At the wooden counter in the center, Wren sat leaning over her workbench, a magnifying lens over her right eye, carefully reassembling the escapement of an antique clock sent by a client from New Orleans. Her hair had grown slightly longer, loosely tied back, and her white blouse carried a small sparrow pin on the left side of her chest. A soft chime rang as the door opened. She lifted her head, and her smile was already there before she saw him. Raphael stood at the doorway, still in his familiar black suit, holding a small velvet box. He stepped forward, placed it on the counter before her. Wren removed the lens, set down her screwdriver, and looked at the box for a moment before opening it. Inside, on pristine white velvet, lay a delicate white gold pendant watch, its face no larger than a coin, its edges engraved with intricate patterns. On the lid were 2 names intertwined into a single design, Wren and Raphael. She turned it over. On the back was a small inscription in an old Hungarian phrase Raphael had carried since his father first taught him about time. Idu meli gyogit. He spoke softly. Time heals. My father used to say the best watch is not the most beautiful one, but the one that remembers the important moments. This is ours. Wren lifted the watch, slipped the chain over her head, and let it rest against her chest near her heart. As the second hand began to move, its quiet ticking sounded steady and sure, like a new heartbeat beginning. Wren looked up at Raphael, and for the first time in many years, for the first time since before the night her father died, she smiled a real smile, one that hid nothing, pleased no one, simply the smile of a woman who had finally come home. Raphael extended his hand across the counter, palm open, without demand, without urgency. She placed her hand in his, and their fingers intertwined for the first time. She had once been a woman who ran, running from a man, from a past, from herself. Now she stood in the sunlight of a kingdom no one in this country dared to touch, beside a man who chose her not for beauty, not for perfection, but because she brought him back a sound he thought he had lost forever, the sound of time beating once again. If Wren and Raphael's story has touched even a small corner of your heart, don't forget to like to help us continue bringing meaningful stories every day. Share this story with those you love. Perhaps someone out there needs to hear it at just the right moment in their life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any emotional journeys in the videos ahead. We truly want to hear your thoughts. How do you feel about Wren's journey? About Raphael's choices? About the moment 2 lonely souls finally found each other through the ticking of a forgotten watch? Leave your comments below. We will read every single one. We wish all of you listening a life of good health, peace, and quiet happiness each day. And always remember that no pain in this life is beyond the healing of time. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.